The church bells tolled 10 times, blasting their melodious sound over the tiled roofs of Pine Hollow. The morning service at First Evangelical Church was winding down, and the congregation slowly streamed out the oak doors, squinting into the bright Colorado mountain sunshine. The small town, 40 miles from Denver, lived by its own unhurried laws, where everyone knew each other by sight, and Sunday service was not just a religious rite but an important social event. The Reverend Lawrence Pitt stood at the exit, shaking hands with the congregation. He was a tall man with a neatly trimmed graying beard and shrewd blue eyes. In his 50s, he retained a stately figure and a charisma that made him an unquestioned authority in the town. His smile seemed genuine, his gaze attentive, and his handshake firm. "Wonderful sermon, Reverend," smiled Eleanor Benson, an elderly widow who lived across the street from the church. "Your words about forgiveness touched my heart." "Thank you, Mrs. Benson. Forgiveness is the way to heal the soul," Lawrence replied with a soft smile. Next to the pastor stood his wife Martha, a woman with kind brown eyes and barely visible wrinkles that spoke of years of smiles and experiences. Her brown hair with silver strands was gathered into a neat bundle. Her blue dress, conservative but elegant, emphasized her status as the First Lady of the parish. "Mrs. Pitt, your cookies for the charity fair were delicious," remarked Judy Fowler, one of the most active parishioners. "Thank you, Judy. It's Grandma's recipe," Martha replied warmly, although a careful observer could detect a slight tenseness at the corners of her mouth. As the last of the congregation left the church, a young woman came out the side door with a music folder in her hands. Veronica Wells, the church organist, who had just graduated from the Denver Conservatory of Music last year, was a fresh breeze in the measured life of the parish. Her long red hair fell loosely over her shoulders, and her green dress with white collar was an odd combination of modesty and attractiveness. "Reverend, I wanted to ask about the repertoire for next Sunday," Veronica said. "I think Psalm 84 would fit better with your theme." Lawrence met her gaze for a moment, and a careful observer would have noticed the change in the expression of his eyes. "Certainly, Miss Wells. Let's discuss it tomorrow during our regular service planning meeting." "I look forward to it," Veronica replied with a faint smile. Martha glanced from her husband to the organist and back again, but said nothing, clutching her purse tighter. The Pitts' house was 2 blocks from the church, a white 2-story house with a veranda adorned with blooming hydrangeas. Just beyond the house was the pine forest that gave the town its name. Inside, the house was as spotless as the Pitt family's reputation. Light-colored walls, antique furniture, family photos in wooden frames. When Lawrence returned home after the service, he went straight to his study to prepare for his evening address to the city council. Martha walked to the kitchen and pulled out an envelope hidden behind the cereal cans. A notice from the bank informed her that she was late on a loan payment for the 3rd month in a row. The amount owed was growing, and with it Martha's fear. She didn't tell her husband about her financial difficulties. 2 years ago, she had invested some of the family savings in her brother Theodore's business, a small bakery in a neighboring town. Lawrence has always been skeptical of business ventures' brother-in-law, so Martha decided to help her brother secretly. But the bakery went bankrupt, the money disappeared, and now the bank threatened to withdraw the favorable loan, which Lawrence did not even know about. Martha sighed and hid the envelope back when she heard her husband's footsteps. She tried to smile as Lawrence entered the kitchen. "I'm thinking of inviting Miss Wells to dinner next Friday," he said as he poured himself some coffee. "She's done an amazing job with the choir, and we need to encourage young talent in our community." "Of course, dear," Martha nodded, trying to hide her embarrassment. "I'll prepare something special." That same evening, as the sun began to set over the horizon, Lawrence went back to the church for administrative work. As he explained to his wife, Martha knew it was true. Partially true. Monthly reports did require attention, but over the past 6 months, these evening absences had become all too frequent. In the silence of the empty church, Lawrence's footsteps echoed off the high vaults. In his study, ledgers were waiting for him, but instead of getting straight to work, he pulled out his cell phone and dialed a message. "I'm in. Can you make it?" 15 minutes later, the side door creaked quietly. Veronica walked in, changed into jeans and a loose blouse. looking very different from the morning of the service, less formal, more sincere. "Are you sure no one will see us?" she asked, closing the door. "Absolutely. The guard doesn't go around until 8 o'clock, Lawrence said, moving closer. "I missed you." Their kiss was quick, almost thieving, but filled with a passion that Lawrence hadn't felt for his wife in a long time. "This isn't right," Veronica whispered, though she didn't pull away. "You're married. You're a pastor." "I know," Lawrence sighed, "but I can't stop thinking about you, about us. What would people say if they found out?" "They won't find out," he answered firmly. "I'll arrange everything. We just need time." While Lawrence was in church, Martha sat at the kitchen table, calculating the family budget. The numbers didn't add up no matter how hard she tried. The roof repair loan they'd taken out 3 years ago, their son's student debt, who was now in medical school on the other side of the country, and now a failed investment. Martha realized she had backed herself into a corner. Tomorrow, she was to talk to Ted Baxter, the bank manager. She hoped to restructure the debt, but knew it would be difficult without her husband's knowledge. A heavy secret was weighing on her shoulders, and sometimes Martha felt as if she could physically feel the weight of it. Her gaze fell on the picture on the refrigerator their wedding day, 26 years ago. Lawrence had been an aspiring preacher then, full of enthusiasm and ideals. She was a junior high school teacher who dreamed of a large family. They were happy, truly happy. What changed? When had the warmth between them been replaced by polite coexistence? Martha couldn't name a specific moment. It happened gradually, like the erosion of coastal cliffs, day after day, year after year, until one day you find that the landscape has changed completely. The next morning, Lawrence woke up early and went for a jog as usual. Martha heard the front door slam. She lay there for a while longer, staring at the ceiling, gathering her thoughts before her visit to the bank. Finally, she got up and began to prepare breakfast. When Lawrence returned, pancakes with maple syrup, his favorite, were waiting for him on the table. He kissed his wife on the cheek, a familiar gesture lacking real warmth. "Lots to do today?" Martha asked, pouring his coffee. "Just a normal Monday, visiting the hospice patients, preparing for Bible study, meeting with Miss Wells about the Sunday program," Lawrence listed. "And you?" "Nothing much," Martha lied. "Volunteering at the library, then shopping." She didn't mention meeting Ted Baxter, another little lie to add to their marriage. After breakfast, Lawrence left in the church minivan. Martha changed into her best suit, dark blue, austere, confidence-inspiring, the same one she'd worn to their son's graduation 2 years ago. Horizon Bank was located on Main Street in Pine Hollow, a red brick building with columns. Ted Baxter, a middle-aged man with balding hair and a perpetually concerned expression, met Martha in his office. "Mrs. Pitt, it's good to see you," he said without much joy in his voice. "I've been looking into your situation." The conversation was difficult. Baxter explained that without her husband's signature, the bank couldn't restructure the debt. "But we could consider additional collateral," he added, leafing through the documents. "Do you have life insurance?" "Yes, for both of us." Martha nodded. "But I wouldn't want to use it as collateral." "Unfortunately, you don't have many options, Mrs. Pitt," the banker sighed. "Unless you want to inform your husband, of course." Martha walked out of the bank with a heavy heart. Insurance was their safety cushion, their defense against unforeseen circumstances. Using it to cover their mistake seemed wrong, but telling Lawrence the truth made her even more afraid. Meanwhile, Lawrence met Veronica at a small cafe on the outskirts of town, where they were unlikely to be seen by any of the parishioners. They sat in a far corner, pretending to discuss church business. "I can't go on like this," Veronica whispered. "Every time I see your wife, I feel terrible." "I know," Lawrence replied, covering her hand with his. "But my marriage to Martha has long since become a formality. We just live under the same roof as neighbors." "Then why don't you leave?" Veronica asked, looking into his eyes. Lawrence looked away. They both knew the answer. Divorce would be the end of his career in the church, the loss of the respect of the congregation, the collapse of everything he had spent years building. "There has to be another way," he finally said. That evening there was a knock on the door of the Pitts house. Martha opened it and saw Sheriff Jeb Montgomery, an old family friend. His gray mustache twitched when he smiled, but today his face was serious. "Jeb, is something wrong?" Martha asked, inviting him in. "Nothing urgent, Martha. Just wanted to talk to Lawrence. Is he home?" "He should be back soon. Cup of tea?" They were sitting on the veranda when Lawrence pulled up. When he saw the sheriff's car, he slowed down. "Jeb, to what do I owe this visit?" "Friendly talk, Reverend," replied the sheriff, standing up. "Do you mind if we take a walk?" Martha watched as the two men walked slowly down the street, talking about something. Wondering what about? What could be so important that the sheriff had personally come to their house? She didn't know that Jeb Montgomery had seen Lawrence and Veronica at the cafe, and that the conversation that was now taking place between the two old friends could change all of their lives. Lawrence Pitt sat behind the wheel of his car, tapping his fingers nervously on the steering wheel. The conversation with Sheriff Montgomery 2 weeks ago still echoed in his ears. Jeb hadn't explicitly said he'd seen him with Veronica, but the hints were clear enough. "Small town, Lawrence," the sheriff said then, letting out cigarette smoke. "Here the walls have eyes and the trees have ears. Any mistake could cost you everything you've built." The Reverend understood the warning. Jeb had been his friend since his high school days, but even he couldn't protect the pastor's reputation if the truth about his affair with the young organist became public. Now Lawrence was parked outside the Pine Grove Motel 20 miles from Pine Hollow, far enough away that he wouldn't run into any familiar faces. The timing was right. Tuesday, 3 o'clock in the afternoon, when most of the townspeople were at work, reduced the risk of being seen. Veronica was already waiting in room 17. She'd rented the room 2 hours ago, paying cash and introducing herself as Mrs. Smith. The receptionist, an elderly man with poor eyesight, barely glanced at her. "This is getting harder and harder," Veronica said as Lawrence closed the door behind him. "I'm constantly afraid of someone seeing me, watching me." Lawrence put his arms around her, breathing in the scent of her hair. "I know, but I can't stop seeing you." Their meetings had become regular over the past 3 months. At first it was brief moments alone in church under the pretense of preparing for services. Then, supposedly random encounters at the town library. Now it's a motel in a neighboring town every Tuesday and Thursday. "We can't go on like this forever." Veronica pulled away and looked into his eyes. "Lawrence, I love you, but these lies are killing me from the inside out. Every time I see your wife in church, I feel like a monster." Lawrence sat down on the edge of the bed, covering his face with his hands. "I'm going to talk to Martha. Soon. It's just, I need to find the right words." The truth was, he was afraid. Not so much of Martha's anger, but of the repercussions for his career, for his status in the congregation. Divorce was practically professional suicide for a pastor in a conservative town like Pine Hollow. "You promise it every time," Veronica said quietly, "but nothing changes." At that moment, Lawrence's cell phone rang. The name Martha popped up on the screen. He dropped the call. "See? Even now, she won't let us be together." He grinned bitterly. Veronica shook her head. "It's not her fault. It was you and me who broke her trust." The phone rang again. Lawrence dropped the call a second time. As they loved each other, rain began to drizzle outside the window. The drops tapped on the glass, creating a melancholy rhythm. Veronica lay with her head on Lawrence's chest and thought about her life. At 23, she had dreamed of a music career in the big city, but instead she was stuck in the provinces, falling in love with a married man twice her age. "Sometimes I think we should just run away from here," she whispered. "Start over somewhere where no one knows us." Lawrence did not answer. He thought about it too, but he realized that running away would mean giving up everything he'd achieved over the years, from respect, from financial stability, from power over the minds and hearts of his parishioners. "I'll find a way out," was all he said, kissing her forehead. Martha Pitt stood at the window, staring out at the rain. The third missed call. Lawrence never missed 3 calls in a row, especially when she wrote in the message that it was urgent. The urgency was a letter from the bank that arrived today. Ted Baxter wasn't kidding when he talked about urgency. Now the bank was threatening to go to court to collect the debt, and Lawrence would find out everything from the summons if she didn't tell him first. Where is he now? The calendar on the refrigerator was empty for Tuesday. No official appointments, no commitments. Administrative work, he'd say when he got back. But Martha no longer believed that excuse. She dialed the church's number. The watchman, old Henry, answered the phone. "Good afternoon, Henry. Is Lawrence there?" "No, Mrs. Pitt. I haven't seen the Reverend today." "Are any of the staff here?" "Just me and Mrs. Clark in the clerk's office." "And Miss Wells?" The question was out of her mouth before Martha could think. "The organist? I haven't seen her since choir practice yesterday." Martha thanked and hung up. Anxiety grew inside her, mingling with the suspicions she'd been trying to chase away for the past few months. Little details added up to an unpleasant picture: the late returns, the inattentiveness, the new habit of showering immediately after coming home, and that special cologne Lawrence used to use only on special occasions. The ringing of the doorbell interrupted her thoughts. A messenger stood on the doorstep with a bouquet of flowers. "Mrs. Pitt?" The young man smiled. "Delivery for you." Martha accepted the bouquet of white lilies with surprise. When the courier left, she opened the attached card. "Sorry about the missed calls. Urgent meeting with the Board of Trustees. I'll be late. Lawrence." Martha put the flowers in a vase, but the anxiety wouldn't let up. Lawrence never gave her flowers for nothing, only for birthdays, wedding anniversaries, or Valentine's Day. And he certainly didn't send them by courier. She picked up the phone and dialed the number of Elaine Whitmore, wife of the head of the Board of Trustees. "Elaine? It's Martha. I'm sorry to bother you, but do you know when today's board meeting will end?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. "What are you talking about, dear? The council doesn't meet until next Tuesday." Martha's heart skipped a beat. "But Lawrence said—" She faltered. "I must have gotten confused. Thank you, Elaine." Martha sank slowly back into her chair. Lawrence had lied. Not for the first time, apparently. Where is he really? And with whom? That evening, when Lawrence returned home, Martha was already sitting in the living room with a glass of wine, a rare weakness for her. "How was the meeting with the Board of Trustees?" she asked without looking at her husband. "Tiring as usual," Lawrence replied, hanging up his jacket. "Henry was complaining again about the leaky roof at Sunday school." "That's strange." Martha took a sip. "I spoke to Elaine Whitmore today. She said the board doesn't meet until next Tuesday." Lawrence froze. Martha saw his shoulders tense. "Are you checking up on me? Should I be?" She finally looked at him. Something flashed in his gaze that Martha hadn't seen before. Irritation? Fear? Anger? "I was with Michael Dorsey," Lawrence said after a pause. "He asked for a confidential meeting to discuss problems in his marriage. You know I can't divulge such things." Martha knew that pastoral confidentiality was a sacred thing to Lawrence. She also knew it was the perfect cover for lying. "Of course," she nodded. "Thanks for the flowers, by the way." "You're welcome." Lawrence smiled. "I thought you deserved a little surprise." Martha smiled back, but something in her soul broke completely. 26 years of marriage, and he'd never given her flowers without an occasion. Until today, when he needed an alibi. "By the way," she said, deciding to change the subject, "there's a letter from the bank. We need to talk." Lawrence frowned. "About what?" Martha took a deep breath and told him everything. About helping her brother, about the failed business, about the loan and the mounting debt. She spoke without raising her eyes, expecting an explosion of indignation. But Lawrence reacted surprisingly calmly. "I understand why you helped Theodore," he said. "He is your brother. But I'm sorry you didn't confide in me sooner. You always said he was irresponsible. He is. But you could have told me about the problems when they first arose. We could have found a solution together." There was a concern in his voice that Martha hadn't heard in a long time. It was almost like the old days when they really were a team. "The bank offered to use our life insurance as collateral," Martha continued. "But I declined. It's our safety cushion." Lawrence wondered. "How much is the life insurance?" $250,000 for each of us. But I don't think it's worth—" "I'll talk to Ted tomorrow," Lawrence interrupted her. "Perhaps there are other options." That night, Martha couldn't sleep for a long time. Something in her husband's reaction troubled her. He was too calm, too... interested in the details of the insurance policy. Or was it just her paranoia, heightened by suspicions of infidelity? The next day, Lawrence did visit the bank. Ted Baxter was surprised to see the Reverend in his office. "Martha told me all about it," Lawrence said, sitting down in his chair. "I want to know about our options." They discussed debt restructuring, the possibility of selling some of the property, and finally the insurance option. "Insurance policies can indeed serve as collateral," Baxter explained, "but it's a last resort. If you can't pay the debt, the bank will be entitled to an insurance claim in case of, in case of death," Lawrence finished for him. "I understand. Tell me, is the payout automatic?" "Practically. It requires a death certificate and a few formalities. If there are no suspicious circumstances, the process takes 1 to 2 weeks. Lawrence nodded, thinking about what he had heard. "I would prefer not to use the insurance if there are other options." Baxter agreed that was reasonable, and they continued to discuss alternative solutions. But the thought of the $250,000 that might become available in the event of Martha's death was already brewing in Lawrence's mind. Friday evening, Lawrence and Veronica met again at the motel, but instead of passion, their conversation was filled with plans. "I can't just leave her," Lawrence said, pacing the room. "It would be a scandal. I'd lose the church, respect, everything." "But we can't go on like this," Veronica objected. "It would ruin us both." Lawrence stopped and looked at her for a long moment. "There is another option," he said slowly. "Martha is insured for a large sum of money." Veronica's eyes widened with horror. "You can't be serious. Think about it." Lawrence sat down beside her, taking her hands in his. "If something had happened to Martha, an accident, for example, no one would have suspected anything wrong. I'd get insurance, we'd wait a decent amount of time, and then we could be together. Officially, openly." This is murder, Lawrence," Veronica whispered, pulling her hands away. "You're a pastor, for heaven's sake. I am first and foremost a man." His voice became harder. "A man who loves you and wants to be with you without having to hide in cheap motels." Veronica stood up and stepped back to the window, wrapping her arms around herself. "I can't be a part of this. I don't want to." "Then we'll continue as we are now," Lawrence replied coldly. "Meeting in secret, lying to everyone, including ourselves, that one day everything would change." She turned to him, and tears glistened in her eyes. "There's a difference between lying and murder, Lawrence, and if you can't see that difference, then I don't know you anymore." For the next 2 weeks, Lawrence was unusually attentive to Martha. He brought her breakfast in bed, gave her little gifts, offered to take her for walks together. Martha was puzzled by this sudden change, but decided to enjoy the moment. Maybe their marriage could still be saved. But at night, lying awake, Lawrence contemplated a plan. He stopped seeing Veronica, although he continued to exchange short messages with her. She was frightened by his idea and refused to discuss it. But Lawrence knew she loved him, and if he presented her with an already fait accompli, she would have no choice but to accept it. The plan took shape gradually. Lawrence remembered that Martha loved lonely walks around Pine Lake, a small body of water about a mile from town. She especially liked to go there on cloudy days when the shore was empty, the perfect place for an accident. He began gathering what he needed: strong fishing line, almost invisible in the water, heavy rocks, one of Martha's old jackets which she hadn't worn in a long time. The plan was simple: offer Martha a joint walk around the lake, citing a desire to discuss their problems in private. Then, at the most secluded part of the route, push her into the water. With the rocks tied down, she'll go down quickly. It will look like an accident, slipped on wet rocks, fell into the water. Given her fondness for lonely walks, no one will be surprised to find her there. On Saturday, May 10th, the forecast promised overcast weather, perfect conditions for his plan. Lawrence suggested a walk to Martha, and she gladly accepted. "It's been a long time since we've spent time together," she said, getting ready. "It's a wonderful idea." Lawrence smiled, feeling a strange mixture of determination and guilt. "Yes, we have a lot to talk about." They walked along the shore of the lake, holding hands. Clouds hung over the water, creating an ominous atmosphere. Lawrence felt the weight of the stones and fishing line in his jacket pocket. A few more minutes and they would reach the most secluded part of the route, the narrow path between the rocks and the water. "What did you want to talk about?" Martha asked, breaking the silence. Lawrence squeezed her hand a little harder. "About us, about our future. You seem so serious." "This is a serious conversation." They approached the rocks. Lawrence looked around. No one was around, just as he had hoped. It was time. "Martha," he began, pausing, "I've been thinking about—" At that moment, his cell phone rang. The name Veronica popped up on the screen. Martha saw it and froze. Their gazes met, and Lawrence realized that she knew, maybe not everything, but enough. "Who is Veronica?" Martha asked quietly, though from the look in her eyes, she had already guessed the answer. Lawrence turned the phone off. "No one important, just a parishioner with a question." "Saturday? When you told everyone you were taking the day off for the family?" Martha took a step back, approaching the edge of the path where the water splashed against the slippery rocks. Lawrence felt adrenaline rush into his bloodstream. It was now or never. But instead of taking a step forward, he stopped. He saw not only suspicion but pain in his wife's eyes. 26 years together. Maybe not always happy, but together nonetheless. "I'm sorry," he said suddenly, not believing his words. I'm confused." Martha shook her head, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Are you sleeping with her? With this Veronica?" Lawrence didn't answer, but his silence was more eloquent than any words. "I knew it." Martha wiped away her tears. "I'm not blind, Lawrence. I'm not stupid. I saw you looking at her in church." She took another step backward, and Lawrence instinctively put out his hand to support her. But it was too late. Martha slipped on a wet rock and fell into the water with a cry. Lawrence froze, watching his wife struggle with the current. He could have rushed to her aid. He should have rushed to her aid. But instead he stood there, paralyzed by a strange mixture of horror and relief. Fate had decided for him. Martha screamed, calling for him, but her cries grew fainter and fainter until they stopped altogether. The water swallowed her up, leaving only diverging circles on the surface. Lawrence looked around. There was no one, just him and the silent lake that now held his secret. He threw the prepared rocks and fishing line into the water, destroying the evidence of his failed plan. Then he pulled out his cell phone and dialed the emergency number. 9111, how can I help you? "My wife fell into the lake!" he shouted, putting all the horror he could into his voice. "She can't swim! Pine Lake, north side!" 2 hours later, the lake shore was filled with police cars and emergency vehicles. Divers searched the bottom while Sheriff Jeb Montgomery comforted an inconsolable widower. "She just slipped," Lawrence repeated, sitting on a bench with a blanket around his shoulders. "I tried to save her, but the current, it was too strong." Jeb nodded, but something in his gaze made Lawrence nervous. The sheriff had known him too long to fully believe his words. "We'll find her, Lawrence," the sheriff said. "In the meantime, you'd better go home. Get some rest." But Lawrence shook his head. "I'll stay here. Until the end." At dusk, searchlights illuminated the surface of the lake. One of the divers raised his hand, signaling a find. A few minutes later, Martha Pitt's body was pulled from the water and laid on the shore. Lawrence approached his wife, feeling all eyes directed toward him. He knelt down beside the body, ignoring the wet ground. Tears streamed down his face, sincere tears to his own surprise. "I'm sorry," he whispered, and only he knew exactly what he was apologizing for. Detective Gloria Ramirez sat at her desk in the Pine Hollow police station, looking at photos from the scene. 4 days had passed since Martha Pitt's death, and something about the case continued to disturb her professional instincts. At first glance, it looked like an accident. A woman had slipped on wet rocks and drowned. A simple tragedy, the kind of thing that happens a lot at mountain lakes. "I don't see why we're wasting resources investigating an obvious accident," Sheriff Montgomery grumbled, stopping at her desk. "We have more important things to do." Gloria looked up at her superior. Jeb Montgomery, a local law enforcement legend, 30 years as sheriff, knew every resident of Pine Hollow personally, including the Reverend Lawrence Pitt, his childhood friend. "I just want to make sure we haven't missed anything," she replied calmly. Standard procedure. Lawrence just lost his wife. I could hear the irritation in the sheriff's voice. He doesn't need us poking around in his personal life. Gloria held back a sigh. She'd only worked at Pine Hollow for 3 years, having moved from Denver after her divorce. Enough time to understand how a small town worked. Connections, friendships, history, it all meant more than anywhere else. I'm not digging into his personal life, Sheriff, she said, but I do have questions that need answers. Like, why did we find fishing line and rocks at the scene that shouldn't have been there? Montgomery frowned. The lakeshore is full of trash from fishermen. That doesn't mean anything. The rocks were wrapped in the fishing line methodically, not as random trash. And why didn't the Reverend jump into the water after his wife? He claims the current was too strong, but the Weather Service reports it was weak that day. Have you ever seen someone you love drown before your eyes? The sheriff's voice got rougher. People panic. They freeze. It's a normal reaction. Gloria realized it was useless to argue. The sheriff would defend his friend to the end, but she had a job to do, and she was going to do it professionally. I just want to talk to the Reverend again, she said. And to the organist, Miss Wells. She had called him a few minutes before the incident. Montgomery's face froze. How do you know about that call? From the phone records, Gloria pointed to the document in front of her. Standard procedure, Sheriff. Montgomery stared at her in silence for a few seconds, then nodded. Do your job, Ramirez. But remember, tact and respect are valued here, especially when it comes to a pillar of the community. When the sheriff left, Gloria turned back to the photos. Something kept bothering her. The fishing line and the rocks. The look on Lawrence Pitt's face as they retrieved his wife's body from the water, and the mysterious call from the young organist minutes before Martha's death. The Pitt home was plunged into mourning. Black ribbons adorned the front door, and the living room was littered with flowers and condolence cards. Lawrence sat on the sofa, dressed in all black, receiving visitors who had come to offer their condolences. His face was haggard, his eyes red from sleep deprivation and tears. Reverend Pitt, Gloria approached him after the last visitor had left. Thank you for agreeing to talk to me. I realize this is a difficult time for you. Lawrence looked at her with tired eyes. Detective Ramirez, Jeb warned me you were coming. What can I do for you? I'd like to ask a few clarifying questions about the day your wife died, if you don't mind. He nodded, pointing to the chair across from me. I've already told Sheriff Montgomery everything. Yes, I read your statement. Gloria pulled out a notebook. But there are some details that need clarification. For example, you said you suggested a walk around the lake to discuss financial matters with your wife. Which ones? Lawrence sighed. Martha recently confided that we were having trouble with a bank loan. She had invested some money in her brother's business, which had gone bankrupt. We discussed options for restructuring the debt. And how did that conversation go? We didn't have time to go over all the details. There was an accident. Gloria made a note in her notebook. Shortly before your wife fell, you received a call from Miss Veronica Wells, the organist at your church. What was this call about? Lawrence tensed, his fingers clenched lightly on the armrests of his chair. Church business. Miss Wells wanted to discuss the repertoire for the next service. On Saturday? When did you take the day off for family matters? She didn't know I had the day off, Lawrence answered quickly. I didn't answer the phone. But your wife saw who was calling. Gloria watched his reaction carefully. Did it affect your conversation in any way? Lawrence looked away. Martha asked who Veronica was. I explained that she was the organist. Then we continued walking and there was an accident. I understand, Gloria nodded. One more question. At the scene of the accident, stones wrapped in fishing line were found. Can you explain their origin? Lawrence turned pale. I don't know what you're talking about. I didn't see any fishing line or stones. That's strange because they were less than 3 meters from where your wife fell. Gloria closed her notebook. Thank you for your time, Reverend. Again, my condolences. Leaving Pitt's house, Gloria got into her car and made a note in her notebook. Nervous at the mention of Veronica Wells, denies knowledge of fishing line and rocks. Next step is to talk to Miss Wells. Veronica Wells lived in a small rented apartment above a bookstore on Main Street in Pine Hollow. When Gloria knocked on the door, She had to wait almost a minute before the door opened, and she saw the pale face of a young woman. "Miss Wells? Detective Gloria Ramirez, may I come in? I have some questions about Martha Pitt's death." Veronica looked startled, but stepped back, letting the detective inside. The apartment was small but cozy, with a piano taking up most of the living room, and stacks of sheet music spread out on every surface. "I don't see how I can help," Veronica said, nervously rubbing the sleeve of her sweater. "I wasn't even there when she—" "But you called Reverend Pitt a few minutes before his wife drowned," Gloria said. "That coincidence interested me." Veronica sat on the edge of the couch, her hands trembling. "I called about the church service. I wanted to confirm the details." "Saturday afternoon? When did Reverend Pitt take the day off for family matters?" "I didn't know he had the day off," Veronica answered quickly, echoing Lawrence's words. Gloria suppressed a smile. The answers were too similar, clearly coordinated. "Miss Wells, how long have you been working at Reverend Pitt's church?" About a year. I moved here after I graduated from the conservatory." "And what's your relationship with the Reverend?" Veronica looked up, her eyes widening. "Professional, of course. He's my supervisor." "Just your supervisor?" Gloria asked softly. "I have reason to believe that there is a closer relationship between you and Reverend Pitt." That's not true." Veronica's voice shook. "Miss Wells, I checked the registration records of the Pine Grove Motel in a neighboring town. You and Reverend Pitt have been renting a room there regularly on Tuesdays and Thursdays for the past 3 months. Veronica's face turned even paler. "I don't know what you mean. The desk clerk recognized you from a photograph." It was a lie, but Gloria decided to take a chance. "Miss Wells, withholding information in a death investigation is a serious offense." Veronica covered her face with her hands, and her shoulders shook with sobs. "We love each other," she whispered through her tears, "but Lawrence would never hurt Martha. Never." Gloria sat down beside her. "Then why did you call him that day?" Veronica pulled her hands away from her face, her eyes full of fear and guilt. I wanted to warn him. He'd said terrible things a few days before, about how if Martha died, he'd get the insurance and we could be together. I refused to be a part of it, and we had a fight. But then I found out that he invited her for a walk to the lake anyway, and I got scared." "You thought he was going to kill his wife?" "I didn't know. I hoped he'd come to his senses, but I had to be sure," Veronica sobbed. "When he didn't answer the phone, I panicked, and then I found out that Martha was dead." Gloria nodded slowly, putting the pieces of the puzzle together. "Miss Wells, I need you to put this statement on the record." Veronica looked frightened. "He's going to find out what I told you. He'll never forgive me." "This is about a possible murder," Gloria said firmly. "You have to decide what's more important to you, protecting a man who may have killed his wife or helping justice." The young woman was silent for a long time, struggling with her inner conflict. Finally, she looked up at the detective, and there was determination in her eyes. "I will tell you everything I know, but you must guarantee my safety." At the Pine Hollow police station, Sheriff Montgomery was thrashing around his office, casting angry glances at Gloria. "You arrested Reverend Pitt based on the testimony of a girl in love? Do you realize what a scandal that would cause?" "I have more than just her testimony," Gloria replied calmly. "Forensics confirmed that the fishing line and rocks found at the scene were probably meant to weigh the body down. They have Lawrence's fingerprints on them. And we've got motive. $250,000 worth of insurance and an affair with Veronica." "It's all circumstantial evidence," exclaimed the sheriff. "Any lawyer would blow them all to smithereens." "Maybe," Gloria agreed. "But there's something else. I got the surveillance tapes from the fishing supply store. Lawrence Pitt bought the exact same line a week before his wife died." Montgomery slumped in his chair, his face aged 10 years. "I've known this man all my life," he said quietly. "We grew up together, played soccer together in high school. He baptized my children. How could he—" "People change, Sheriff," Gloria replied softly. "Sometimes for the worse." "I want to talk to him." The sheriff stood up. "In private. It's not protocol." "To hell with protocol. He's my friend, and if he really did it, I want to hear the truth from him personally." Gloria knew she should object, but something in the sheriff's eyes, pain, disappointment, hope, made her nod. 5 minutes, no more, and I'll be behind the mirror. Lawrence Pitt sat in the interrogation room, his hands clasped in front of him as if in prayer. When the door opened and Sheriff Montgomery entered, he looked up, and relief flashed across his face. "Jeb, thank God! That woman detective has lost her mind. She arrested me on a false charge." Montgomery sat silently opposite and looked at his friend for a long time. "Lawrence, I've known you for 35 years, he said at last. "I was best man at your wedding. I held your son over the font when you baptized him. I trusted you with everything." "And you can trust me now," Lawrence said insistently. "That Ramirez woman made up the whole story. Yes, I had an affair with Veronica. I'm a sinner, and I admit it. But I would never do anything to hurt Martha." The sheriff pulled a photograph out of a folder and placed it on the table. It showed Lawrence buying fishing line at the store. "Explain this." Lawrence turned pale. "Yeah, I love fishing. You know that. You haven't fished in 3 years, not since you started having back problems," the sheriff said quietly. "Lawrence, for God's sake, tell me the truth. Were you planning to kill Martha?" There was a heavy silence in the room. Behind the one-way mirror, Gloria held her breath as she watched the scene. Lawrence lowered his head, his shoulders slumped. "Yeah, I've been thinking about it." His voice was barely audible. The fishing line and the rocks were for it. But at the last moment, I couldn't do it. "I'm not a monster, Jeb. But Martha's dead anyway," the sheriff said gravely. "How, Lawrence? How did it happen?" Lawrence looked up and there were tears in his eyes. "It was an accident. A real accident. She saw Veronica's name on my phone and started asking questions. We got into an argument. She backed up and slipped on the rocks. I swear to God, Jeb, I didn't push her. But you didn't jump in after her." The sheriff's voice was dead calm. "You didn't try to save her." Lawrence covered his face with his hands. I panicked. And then a part of me thought this was the solution to all my problems. Fate. God's will. I just, stood there and watched her drown. Maybe that makes me a killer. Maybe it doesn't, but I swear to you I didn't push her into the water. Behind the mirror, Gloria watched the Reverend's body language carefully. His remorse seemed genuine, but something in his story still didn't add up. Sheriff Montgomery sighed heavily. "You know what I have to do, Lawrence. You admitted to planning the murder, and although you claim you didn't carry out your plan, you let Martha drown." "I know," Lawrence nodded. "I deserve to be punished. For my sins, for my weakness, for my cowardice." At that moment, the door to the room opened, and an agitated Gloria entered. "Sheriff, I need to talk to you. Immediately." Montgomery reluctantly left the room. "What is it, Ramirez? I almost got a confession." "We have new information," Gloria said, handing him a folder. "The autopsy results just came back from Denver. Martha Pitt didn't drown." "What? There's virtually no water in her lungs. She was dead before she hit the lake. Cod was an overdose of sleeping pills. Toxicology found a concentration 10 times higher than therapeutic." The sheriff looked at the photos in the report, his face turning gray. "That's impossible. Lawrence just admitted that she slipped and fell into the water." "Maybe he's not telling the whole truth." Gloria opened another document. "And there's something else. We checked Martha Pitt's financial records. The week before she died, she changed the beneficiary of her insurance policy. The money wasn't supposed to go to her husband, but to their son." "She knew," the sheriff said slowly. "She knew about the affair and suspected the worst." "Perhaps," Gloria nodded. "But it also meant that Lawrence couldn't get insurance. His motive was gone." "Unless he knew about the change," the sheriff said thoughtfully. They returned to the interrogation room where Lawrence sat with his head down. "Reverend Pitt," Gloria began, "did you know that your wife had changed the beneficiary of her insurance policy a week before she died?" Lawrence looked up, a look of genuine surprise on his face. "What? No, I didn't know anything about that." "You also failed to mention that your wife had taken sleeping pills before your walk," Gloria continued. "In fact, so high a dose that she was dead before she even hit the water." Lawrence looked stunned. "That's impossible. She had never taken sleeping pills. She was allergic to most sedatives." Gloria and the sheriff looked at each other. "Reverend, if your wife didn't take sleeping pills but died of an overdose, that means someone gave her those drugs without her knowledge," Gloria said softly. "And given the time of her death, it must have happened during the breakfast you shared before your walk." I never," Lawrence stammered, his eyes widening with horror. "Oh dear, tea." Veronica had brought herbal tea for Martha that morning, said it would help her relax before we talked. "Veronica was at your house the morning of Martha's death?" the sheriff asked sharply. "Yes, she was." Lawrence stopped, realization slowly creeping into his face. "She knew about our walk, knew what I was going to do, what I was planning to do, but she was against it. She refused to be a part of it." "Or so she wanted you to think," Gloria said thoughtfully. "Sheriff, I need a search warrant for Miss Wells' apartment. Immediately." When the police entered Veronica Wells' apartment, they found her gone, leaving only a hastily packed suitcase and scattered belongings. But in the bathroom trash can, they found an empty package of powerful sleeping pills. "She beat us to it," the sheriff said, looking around the apartment. "Probably left the state by now." Gloria was examining the sheet music table when she noticed an envelope that said, "To Lawrence." She opened it carefully, putting on her gloves. "Sheriff, you should see this." The letter was short but spoke volumes. "Lawrence, you could never do this. You're too weak. You've always been like that. You talk about bold decisions, but you back out at the last minute. I did it for both of us, so that we could be together without looking back. Martha found out about us anyway. She changed the insurance, but now we have a chance to start over with a clean slate. I love you. Find me when things calm down. Forever yours, V." Sheriff Montgomery reread the letter twice, then looked at Gloria. She'd killed Martha and tried to frame Lawrence. Or they did it together, and now she's taking the blame, Gloria observed. Either way, we need to find her. In the same interrogation room where Lawrence Pitt had been sitting an hour earlier, Veronica Wells was now sitting. She was found at a bus station in Denver getting ready to leave for California. She looked exhausted, but a strange fire burned in her eyes. "I did it," she said without preamble as Gloria sat down across from her. "I killed Martha Pitt." Lawrence didn't know anything. "We found your letter, Miss Wells," Gloria replied, "but I'm wondering why you've decided to take the blame." "Because it's the truth," Veronica said firmly. "I put sleeping pills in Martha's tea. I knew Lawrence was planning to do something during the walk, but I was afraid he'd change his mind at the last minute." "Why did you call him before Martha died?" "I wanted to make sure he wouldn't do anything stupid, try to save her or something." But he didn't answer. Gloria watched the young woman, trying to figure out if she was telling the truth or protecting her lover. "Do you realize you're confessing to premeditated murder? You could be sentenced to life in prison." Veronica smiled bitterly. "I know, but what is my life compared to his? People need him. His sermons, his faith. He helps so many people. And me?" She sounded genuinely convinced, but Gloria wasn't jumping to conclusions. "Do you love him so much that you would sacrifice your life?" "Yes," Veronica answered without hesitation. "Isn't that what love is all about? Sacrificing yourself for another?" Gloria shook her head. "Love isn't killing innocent people or taking the blame for the man who used you. It's not—" Reverend Pitt confessed to planning his wife's murder. Gloria interrupted her. "He bought the fishing line, prepared the rocks. He thought of everything. And when she slipped and fell into the water, he just stood there and watched her drown." Veronica's face changed, a look of doubt in her eyes. "He, confessed?" "Completely. The only thing he didn't know was that you drugged him and that Martha changed the beneficiary of the insurance policy. He wouldn't get the money, their son would." Veronica slowly settled back in her chair as if the air had been sucked out of her. "He didn't know. Tell me the whole truth, Veronica," Gloria said softly. "Not for his sake, for your own sake, and for Martha's sake." The young woman sat still for a long moment, then slowly looked up. "It all started 6 months ago." Sheriff Montgomery stood in front of the mirror, watching the interrogation. Next to him was Lawrence Pitt, pale and drained. "I never asked her to do this," he whispered. "I swear I didn't know about the sleeping pills." "But you planned to kill your wife," the sheriff replied quietly. "And when she fell into the water, you let her drown." I panicked. Lawrence clenched his fists. I couldn't move. And then it was too late. And you didn't tell us that Veronica had come to your house that morning. I didn't think it was important. I didn't know that she... The sheriff shook his head. You don't understand, do you? Even now, you're only thinking about yourself, about your reputation, about your church, about your future. But Martha is dead, Lawrence, and part of the blame lies with you, no matter who gave her the sleeping pills. Behind the glass, Veronica continued her confession. He told me he loved me, that we'd be together when this was over. I refused to be a part of his plan at first, but then I thought if I did it on my own, he'd never find out, and his hands would stay clean. I wanted to protect him, you know? I truly believed I was doing it out of love. Gloria listened, writing down every word. And you put sleeping pills in her tea. Yes, it was easy. I brought a special herbal tea, said it would help her relax before their important conversation. She drank it before they left. Did you know she had changed the beneficiary of the insurance? Veronica shook her head. No, I only found out when it was too late. I wanted to talk Lawrence out of it, to warn him, but he didn't answer the phone. Do you still love him? Gloria asked. Veronica was silent for a long time, then answered quietly. I thought I knew him. I thought he was special, that behind the pastor's mask there was a passionate, real man. But if he really did plan to kill his wife and let her drown, then I don't know who I loved. Sheriff Montgomery turned to Lawrence. Did you hear her? She's confessing everything, trying to protect you, and you stand there silent and let her take all the blame. Lawrence met the sheriff's gaze, and the pain of realization was reflected in his eyes. What have I done, Jeb? I've ruined everything. My life, Veronica's life, the memory of Martha. There's only one way to fix anything, the sheriff said firmly. Tell the truth, the whole truth. Lawrence stared through the glass at the crying Veronica for a long moment, then nodded slowly. I'm ready. 2 weeks later, Pine Hollow Court was full. The story of Reverend Pitt and the young organist had become a sensation not only in the small town, but throughout the state. Killer pastor! The headline screamed. Deadly passion, echoed the TV stations. Detective Gloria Ramirez sat in the back row, watching Lawrence Pitt and Veronica Wells enter the courtroom, escorted by security. Both pleaded guilty, Veronica to first-degree premeditated murder, and Lawrence to conspiracy to murder and failure to render aid. Next to Gloria sat Sheriff Montgomery, his face grim. You solved the case, Ramirez, he said quietly. Good job. Thank you, Sheriff, she replied. But there's nothing good in this story. There's the truth, Montgomery shook his head. And the truth is always better than a lie, no matter how bitter. The judge began the hearing, and the room fell silent. Gloria looked at Lawrence and Veronica, sitting separately, avoiding each other's gaze. Love that had turned into obsession, passion that led to murder. Sin followed not by redemption, but only new sins. As the judge read the charges, Gloria thought of Martha Pitt, a woman she'd never known in life but whose fate she'd helped uncover after her death. An ordinary woman who loved her husband, tried to save her brother, kept secrets, and finally realized her husband was cheating on her, who cheated on her insurance beneficiary to protect her son, unsuspecting that her last day would come so soon. Will the defendants please rise? The judge said. Lawrence and Veronica rose at the same time, two people whose lives were intertwined in a tragic story of betrayal and death. How do you plead to the charges against you? Guilty, said Lawrence Pitt, his voice firm. Guilty, Veronica Wells echoed. Gloria met the sheriff's gaze, and they nodded silently. Justice had been done. But the price of that justice had been high. 3 lives, one cut short forever, the other 2 to be spent behind bars. And the small town of Pine Hollow, forever changed by the story of a pastor who forgot his own sermons about love, faithfulness, and the commandment, "Thou shalt not kill."